So I competed last weekend at the WRPF drug-tested holiday bash, where I weighed in under the 100 kg weight class limit of 220 pounds. Just 4 days prior to that, I was weighing 234 pounds. So here's how I lost over 14 pounds in 4 days without cutting a single calorie to make my weight class. So what's up guys, Desi Cooney with Team Outlier here. So like I mentioned, I competed last weekend and the meet itself went okay. But I'm more so here just to talk about the weight cut portion of it. For context, this is my 11th meet and I've cut weight for almost all of them, so this is a process I'm already pretty well familiar with. Over the years, I've taken a lot of guidance from other coaches and their protocols, most notably I would say JP Cauchi and Steve Denovi more recently. But along the way, I've tinkered it, added my own tweaks to it, and really just kind of fine-tuned the process that works best for myself. I should also definitely add at this point that this is just something I've done, not medical advice or anything that I'm necessarily advising you to do. And now that that's out of the way, we can talk about exactly how I did it. So the first step was this chart, which is a log of my weight in the morning and in the evening in the days immediately prior to weigh-ins. This is something I have my athletes do as well when they're cutting weight. And what this does is it gives me a predictable average of the amount of weight I tend to lose overnight, so that I can guesstimate where I'm going to wake up at on weigh-in day morning, depending on what weight I go to bed at. And you can see on average here, I was losing about 3 pounds overnight. The first intervention I took was water and sodium manipulation. For the unfamiliar, water cutting, or just temporary dehydration, is probably the easiest way to temporarily lower your body weight to make weight in a weight class sport. How water cutting works is that it starts with a loading period, where in the days leading into the meet, you're taking in a lot more water than usual, gallons and gallons of it per day. And what this does is it actually impacts certain hormones within the kidneys, namely I think renin and aldosterone, but don't quote me on that. And basically what this has the effect of doing is that it makes your body extremely efficient at excreting water, because it has to, because you're taking in so much of it. And then these hormones will stay elevated even after we cut off water intake, which I'll get into in a little bit. So in the first few days of my water loading, I started by taking in 2 gallons of water per day, and I kind of incrementally worked my way up to 3 gallons the day before I cut off water intake entirely, which is a lot, but I'm someone who drinks a lot of water anyway, so this is what was necessary for me, and others may require less. It's also important to note that in the early days of this water loading, I'm actually adding in electrolytes to the water that I'm drinking to avoid hyponatremia, which is something, it's not fun. You don't want to experience it. Then on the last day before weigh-ins, which for me was on a Wednesday, you cut off water intake entirely. For me, I did this at 21 hours out, and I also wasn't taking in any of those additional added electrolytes with the water I drank on that day to further prevent any water retention. Like I mentioned, however, those kidney hormones were still elevated for me, so even after I stopped taking in all this water, my body was still really efficient at trying to excrete it as frequently as possible, so I was still losing water weight. And that's the basis of water loading. This was also the first meet where I tried gut cutting, at least to the kind of extreme extent that Steve Denovi talked about in a recent video. In the past, for meats, I took other measures to achieve kind of this same outcome of basically having your stomach and your intestines as empty as possible so that your body weight is as light as possible on meat day. But this was really the first time I truly altered my diet to this extent in the couple of days leading into weigh-ins. Essentially, for a few days there, it was a diet consisting of foods that were really high in calories, but that didn't weigh very much. Basically, I'm trying to get in as many calories and as many macronutrients as I usually do, so not cutting any calories, but getting them from sources that produce less waste and thus less just dead, useless mass that would weigh me down on the scale. For me, this basically boiled down to, and this is Denovi's recommendation as well, a lot of almonds and protein shakes, a couple of other things too, and also reducing the intake of fibrous vegetables in the week or so leading into weigh-ins, because they tend to pull water into the gut, which is obviously something we're trying to avoid. And I've done that part before, but not the almonds and protein shakes. For me, I'm happy to report this actually worked very well, as you can see, and I'm glad I got the chance to test it out on myself, because now it's something I feel a little bit more comfortable about making recommendations to my athletes. And the final strategy I utilized besides water cutting and gut cutting was acute water depletion. So basically up until this point, which was the day of weigh-ins, it was pretty easy, honestly. It's just kind of sort of setting myself up for success on this day. I woke up early around 5 a.m. because it was a 3-hour drive to the meet and where weigh-ins were. And I also woke up about 2.6 pounds over the weight class limit, which for me was actually exactly kind of where I was hoping to wake up on that day. This is where most people will turn to things like a sauna, or some people it's just hopping on an exercise bike with layers on, or maybe a hot bath. But for me, something that has worked really well once before and that I did again was just using a really hot car and being layered up for that. So I'd done this once before in a meet in Kansas City, which also had about a 3.5 hour drive for me. So the good thing is I already knew on average how much I tend to sweat out per hour in a really, really hot car with layers on. And I was primarily banking on that. For me, this works out to around a pound an hour. But again, if you weigh less than me, it's probably going to be less than this. Or if you sweat a lot more than me, I'm not really someone who sweats easily, it could be a lot more, I don't know. But I layered up, turned the heat up in the car, and drove out to Des Moines. The other thing I did during this time, so simultaneously with the sweating, was spitting into an empty cup, which is an easy and effective way to get a couple of ounces to maybe even over a pound out. In the past, I've done this with gum to help me produce saliva, and this was the first time I used Jolly Ranchers, which were undeniably more effective. Definitely produced a lot more saliva and allowed you to lose more ounces that way. I was actually almost able to entirely fill up a 28-ounce Gatorade bottle on the 2.5-3 hour drive down there. It's pretty gross. But I'm not sure if I'm actually going to be doing this again, even though it was undeniably more effective, simply because of all the sugar and the acid that was in my mouth. My teeth were so sensitive after doing this that it hurt to brush them for 2 or 3 days afterwards. So for me, it might not actually be worth it, even though it did give me a couple of extra ounces. And that was pretty much it. I rolled into weigh-ins. I weighed in at around 219.5, so again, just over 14 pounds lost total. And then I immediately began rehydrating with water, fluids, and added electrolytes, basically trying to get my body weight back up to the low 230s. Now this was a 24-hour weigh-in, like I said, but I would pretty much use the exact same approach for a 2-hour weigh-in, and I have many times, except that you have less margin for error with the rehydration process, and you usually can't be as extreme with how much weight you're trying to lose. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to follow for more.